We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald, and with me today, special co-host Robbie Martin. Robbie's a longtime journalist and filmmaker. He writes for the magazine White Fungus and Oakland-based news website Media Roots, founded by his sister Abby Martin, who he co-hosts a regular podcast with. He's behind the documentaries American Biscuit, American Anthrax, and A Very Heavy Agenda. Robbie has made appearances on Buzzsaw TV, KPFA's Project Censored, Russia Today, The Corporate Report, Behind the Headlines of Free Speech TV, Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox Radio, has been interviewed by the BBC, Neutral Magazine, and San Francisco Chronicle. Robbie, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Adam. I just realized, too, something. I forgot all those places I went on. One of them is kind of funny to me now because Sean Stone, Oliver Stone's son, was one of the hosts of Buzzsaw. And he's out there now, like hanging out with Rudy Giuliani and posting pictures on Instagram and smoking cigars with him and talking about how he's a great guy. So I just thought kind of interesting to see how some of these sort of older school, deep politics, 9/11 people have kind of moved on to what they're doing now. You know,
exactly. Well, let me ask you, what started you down the road of activism and the personal investment of U.S. foreign policy overall?
I think it really probably started with 9/11, I think, because I happened to be, my girlfriend at the time was, she wasn't a U.S. citizen. She was, she had a student visa. She was a Japanese citizen. And I remember it was sort of like she shattered the default frame that I think that I would have had she not been there that morning on 9/11. She just happened to be staying at my house that morning. And she was only like, we would only see each other maybe like once every other week. So it just happened to be that day she was there. And I remember she was sobbing like after, the first tower was on fire or whatever. And I was sort of like trying to console her. And then I just started to talk to her. I was like, yeah, it's really sad. Like who knows how many people are dead. That kind of sentiment. And she was like, no, I'm America is going to do something really bad. Like that was what her sadness was coming from, that she knew that the retaliation was going to be so much worse than whatever we'd just seen, that she was just like crying over that. And I was like, and that, I think that just sort of shook me out of whatever that default frame would have been as just like a young, dumb American. I was like 19 or 20 at the time. And it was just, I think her saying that really made me realize, wow, like, yeah, this is horrible what happened to us, but what we're about to do is going to change history forever and is going to be really, really evil. Like, no matter what it is, no matter how much they sugarcoat it, America is going to basically, Jack Palance pick up the gun. It's going to be the Old West. And I remember, I had memories of being like scared of the Gulf War when I was a kid and thinking, I'm more grown up now, but I'm scared of us going, like, whatever this war on terror thing is, it's scary. I don't want us to do this. I don't even understand why we're doing this when, they didn't even bother to like make a really good case for why they said bin Laden was behind this. It was just like the train was moving super fast out of the station, unstoppable train. And it was like, you get on board this train, you don't really ask too many questions. George Bush basically said you're either with us or with the terrorists, and all that stuff was really, I think that mentality really scared me at the time. And I think by the combination of, being in a relationship with someone who already sort of had an anti-US foreign policy point of view, although she kind of hid it from me. She didn't really tell me that. Like, I didn't really know her politics in this way until 9/11. It was kind of a crash course for me. And I think it was just that mentality. It was sort of like that pressure. You must comply with this mentality of we need to get revenge. We need to attack Afghanistan. And from the very beginning, I was very against that. And I didn't really have, the education at him. I didn't have like the history of Afghanistan or the Mujahideen. So it was more just like a gut reaction. Like, this is not right. This doesn't feel right. It wasn't like an educated or informed resistance, but that was the start of it. And that's, I think, how it evolved over time. And then I just, would inform myself. And, of course, over the decades, I was like, oh yeah, I was right back then. I just didn't know the reasons why. I just, my feeling was correct. But now that I have the information, I know that feeling was informed by, it's there for a reason. It's a warning almost. It's like America is like a karmic time bomb almost. It's like all these horrible things we've done just keep piling and piling up. And, I think I had some understanding of just that general concept as a young man without understanding it fully.
You spoke about the fear of the reaction of the American military. Was that fear justified, or was it worse? The reaction of the military, was it worse than you expected initially?
I think, I selfishly was a little bit. I think part of me too was a little bit afraid of more attacks. Like if we do these things in these other countries, they're gonna attack us.
Right.
So
it would precipitate more. It would precipitate more attacks.
Yeah, that was part of it. It was like a selfish, like, America, I don't want to be hurt. It's like, oh my God, like now, like, we're opening ourselves up to like basically getting attacked more. But then the other part of it was, yeah, it's like the scariness of, I think that it was worse, Adam, than I thought it was going to be, because I did initially stupidly think it was just going to be Afghanistan. And I thought that was just going to be, as horrible as that was, it was going to be sort of a one and done. We'd kill bin Laden and we'd kill, a bunch of people in the Middle East in that way. And then we'd get out of there. It was way worse than I imagined. I didn't have, that was one thing I think I was naive about, is I didn't realize sort of the imperial foresight and the how badly they wanted to lock in this, basically Middle East, imperial footprint. I didn't have that understanding. So it was worse and scarier.
This will lead right into the questions I have for you now. In your film, A Very Agenda, you spoke at length about the neoconservative movement, and you spoke a focus on the Kagan family. And of course, he's the co-author of the Project for New American Century, Robert Kagan. What made you focus on Kagan specifically?
Well, I think that movie was, if I really boil it all down, it started as a personal mission for me, because I felt that my sister, Abby Martin, had sort of put herself out there and, taken sort of a stance against sort of the editorial line at RT, and then the mainstream media, confused that for being anti-Russian, and then they lifted her up for a second, and then once they found out that she had certain views on 9/11 and other things, they sort of tried to crush her. And one of the people who was leading that charge was this neoconservative guy he was writing for the Daily Beast at the time, named Jamie Kirchick. And when I realized what was happening, when I realized there was like basically a smear campaign that had been sort of put into motion to ruin my sister's reputation, it was really fascinating to me that the people leading the charge of it were like Project for the New American Century associated people. And I kind of got into my head, well, I'm a 9/11 guy. Like I hate these neocons. They're pretty much, to me, some of the most evil people on the planet. So I take this as a sign of war. Like if these people are going to wage war against my sister, then I'm going to wage war against them. And when I had that in my mind, I didn't really know what that meant at first. I thought I was just going to be like, I'm going to ruin Jamie Kirchick, or, like, as I kind of out of revenge. But what I found was I went back into, I just started like watching old PNAC videos. And then I eventually discovered that PNAC had sort of reopened as the Foreign Policy Initiative. So I was just literally staying up, falling asleep to these 3-hour-long C-SPAN videos that to a normal person would probably be like an insane thing to do, to fall asleep to like neocons talking about, whatever. But what happened, Adam, was eventually Robert Kagan came on one of those videos. And as I was falling asleep one night, I'm like, this sounds really different than other neocon. Like some of this almost sounds right. Like I'm almost agreeing with some of the things he's saying, but then like I'm realizing, oh no, but he's cleverly sort of nesting these talking points inside of a larger neocon frame, but he's doing it in a way that I could see how his rhetoric would be very enticing to a liberal or neoliberal person. And I remember being really struck by that. So I started reading about him specifically. Like I kind of got my focus away from Kirchick and Bill Kristol and looking at him specifically. And then I found out that Obama, was carrying around his book, The World America Made. I think it was like right before the inauguration. People had photographed Obama carrying around Robert Kagan's book. So I was like, wow, this is really interesting that this neocon sort of has any influence over Obama. I didn't realize this. I knew Obama was a hawk. I just didn't realize who, necessarily was putting these ideas in his mind. And then I sort of, started doing a little research on him, and I was like, wow, his whole family is plugged into this military industrial complex in really interesting, influential ways that I just had no idea about. I mean, his wife, Victoria Nuland, of course, NATO ambassador. She was the NATO ambassador when NATO basically expanded twofold in the 90s. I mean, most people don't even realize that we took in I think 7 NATO countries in the 1990s. I mean, after the Soviet Union fell, it's like, the whole thing is just crazy when you really unpack it all. Fred Kagan, his brother, is the guy who, came up with the Iraq war surge. He seems like some kind of autistic mathematician genius. He can read, write, and speak fluent Russian. He's an expert in Soviet military history. Probably knows more about Soviet military history than most Soviet military generals do. I mean, this is the kind of weird people they are. And the father of this family, Donald Kagan, is one of the most influential war historians in the United States and in the West. So he's sort of Peloponnesian War, Greek history, ancient war history teachings have sort of shaped the fundamental understanding of warfare in a large way. Even military strategists look back to his writings on the Peloponnesian War as this sort of, teachable moment. And his philosophy, Donald Kagan, the patriarch of the family, his philosophy is war has happened all throughout society. It's always happening. It never stops. So to think that we can stop war is just some naive pipe dream. Like it's always that is the normal state of the world. So you're basically just a dumbass for thinking you're going to stop wars. So war basically his message is that that's normal and that's essentially fine because that's the way the world is. So I think altogether, and of course, I need to mention one more person, Kimberly Kagan. She runs what arguably is the most influential, singularly focused war think tank out of DC called the Institute for the Study of War. So when you combine this whole family together, they have an enormous influence over the way that people in DC think about foreign policy, and they're almost completely obscure. And so that's, that wasn't my initial reason for going after Robert Kagan, but in the end, it feels like it was the right thing to do because, I mean, exposing someone who has that much influence, I think, is important because no one previously really knew anything about him, and I think it sort of and then pulling out that stuff about his father and brother saying they wanted to invade Palestine as a response to 9/11. I mean, that I was, pleased that I was able to find that at the very least, like going after him, because I don't think that would have been, discovered otherwise. I mean, maybe someone else would have found that, but I'll give myself credit for finding that.
It's interesting enough because Robert Kagan his ideology about foreign policy vastly differed even from Colin Powell. For example, in 2000, Robert Kagan sought to explain core differences between the positions of the neoconservatives and those of Colin Powell, in which Kagan said, the problem with Powell is his political and strategic judgment. He doesn't believe the United States should enter conflicts without strong public support, but he also doesn't believe that the public will support anything. That kind of iron logic rules out almost every conceivable post-Cold War intervention. What are your thoughts about what he said?
I mean, it's amazing because, I mean, he's a good rhetorician or whatever you want to call it. I mean, like it sounds right in a way. Like, oh yeah, like Colin Powell, like what's he thinking? He's great. I mean, it's weird because he actually had a similar conversation with me in person. I secretly recorded Robert Kagan, and I asked him, why do you think Obama is dragging his feet on sending the $300 million to Ukraine for offensive weapons? I thought this was something that he was supposed to do. And Robert Kagan's like, well, he told me personally he didn't want nuclear war with Russia. And well, if that's your frame going into it, if you don't want nuclear war, then okay, I guess fine. But like it will. So what would be okay to go to war with Russia if they invade Germany? If they invade, he named all these countries and he went down this list. And it reminds me of what he says about Colin Powell, because it's like he's very into this idea of like, yeah, the U.S. should be able to wage a war whenever it wants, regardless of popular support. And that whole concept is fascinating because it's like, on one hand, I could see that being a really enticing point of view to any military general. It's like, well, yeah, like that America needs to do what it needs to do, regardless of what these idiot, people in the public think we should do. They have no idea they don't have the intelligence we have. They don't have the satellite images we have. So it's an enticing view to sort of get them to believe in. But then it also implies that, I think it's sort of blanketly implying that anybody who has a more conservative view of, being careful about doing this is basically a pussy. It's almost kind of what he's saying. And I think maybe I'm wrong in terming it that way, but I think that's really the subtext of what he's saying. I mean, is like, it's kind of that's kind of a wimp. We're America. We do what we want when we need to do it. And that's the way we need to do it, essentially. I mean, I don't know if that's your take on it, but
no, I agree with this, because that's the neoconservative mindset, is to be aggressive. And that leads perfectly into the next question about during the Reagan era, we saw the Leo Strauss neo-Nazi Paul Wolfowitz and others like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Perle start to turn from the Cold War to the Middle East. Was the Afghan-Soviet War the turning point towards a more concentrated effort in controlling the Middle East by using radical fundamentalism as the pretext to destabilizing the region?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I think I probably need to. I mean, I could definitely be better educated on 80s Reagan foreign policy excursions, but it definitely seems like that was the era in general in which that became sort of the modus operandi of what we were doing. But I mean, in terms of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, I don't really know the answer to that question. I guess for me, I mostly go back to the Taliban during the Clinton era for some reason. But I know that the question you're asking is about, is this when our sort of foreign policy pivot really changed? And I would say that's what you're asking, right? I would say,
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
How about this? Would how much of an influence, say, the Israeli lobby have on U.S. foreign policy as well as the Arab lobby? Is that due to the influence of the neoconservatives in general?
I go back and forth on this a lot. I think that I would say that the Israeli lobby as it exists today it sort of acts, well, in terms of the foreign policy lobbying they do, it sort of acts as an apparatus that plugs into other apparatuses, and it's designed to. So I think on its own, just influencing politicians, it wouldn't really be achieving very much. I think that it almost has to be able to have this sort of symbiotic feedback loop sort of thing going with neocons and these other sort of foreign policy think tanks that act like they're not pro-Israel, or they're not, pro-Israel on the surface. I mean, one of the most blatant ones is probably the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, but a lot of these other think tanks are by default also pro-Israel. So, even the ones that maybe are not openly Zionist acting, they still, the people from those Israeli lobbies still plug into their system and so forth. So I think that I guess I see a little bit more of like it's like the Israeli lobby is like a Lego piece of some kind that plugs into this larger structure. And in terms of the Arab lobby, I don't really know. I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about it. I mean, I'm probably know more about it from the way that the right tries to say that there's secret Muslim infiltration into like various U.S. sectors of government, like the whole Muslim Brotherhood thing that sort of took over a lot of dialogue on the right. I know more about that. So I don't in general know. I mean, I know about like a lot of Saudi money, and into our financial system, but in terms of like the actual lobby, I'm pretty ignorant about it, to be honest.
Well, you would be right on the money, because the Arab lobby is basically made up of lawyers and corporations that are affiliated with Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And by the way, I don't blame you here, because when I read the book Arab Lobby by Dr. Mitchell Bard, it was the only book that actually talked about the Arab lobby in general. It just seems that they're very in the shadows, so to speak, whereas AIPAC is right in your face. They hold these conferences every year, and it's just like they don't care, because they know that the influence that they have can't be dissuaded. And I think that's basically all regarding this huge evangelical population that's within our areas of government. To follow on the next question would be like, you mentioned this in a heavy agenda when you talk about the neocons, about the Office of Special Plans and Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, which was to supply George Bush with raw, unvetted intelligence pertaining to Iraq. How much of an influence did these people have on the war with Iraq?
Oh, I mean, I think Paul Wolfowitz had an enormous amount of influence. Douglas Feith, I'm less familiar with. I mean, I know that he had an enormous amount of influence too, but I was just talking with my sister about this after Colin Powell died, and it's like we're still in this totally bullshit, whitewashed frame of Colin Powell regrets basing his speech off of faulty intelligence. And it's like, first of all, he knew exactly what the White House and the Office of Special Planning was doing at the time. And literally what they were doing was, at best, they were cherry picking intelligence on purpose to create a false narrative, which isn't of itself, that's a form of a lie. If you're only showing like 1/20th of some kind of intelligence information, but you're not showing all the other things that contradict it, which they later admitted were omitted on purpose, then that's lying. So it's not faulty intelligence. It's not like the intelligence they used was, so I guess what I'm saying is this whole idea of, Colin Powell really, I think, brings this into focus. It's like Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney's office. There's a video clip in A Very Heavy Agenda where Eric Edelman, who was part of Dick Cheney's office at the time, is basically being grilled by Dennis Kucinich. And it's one of the only times I've seen one of these neocons actually being specifically asked about what you just said, not the Office of Special Planning, but the idea of how they constructed this intelligence. And he's clearly, he's totally caught. He's clearly up against the wall. He knows that they lied, and he essentially admits that they were shown things that contradicted, the intelligence about Iraq having WMDs, but they didn't show that. So in essence, that is lying. And yeah, Paul Wolfowitz, we know, Paul Wolfowitz actually, and I know you wanted to get into this subject, not maybe right away, but Paul Wolfowitz, one of the specific things he did in the Bush administration that I don't think any other Bush official did, at least on record, is he actually hired old CIA director James Woolsey to come in as a consultant, and to actually, he gave him a budget to do his own investigation, and that's what he calls it, an investigation. I think it was more of a propaganda campaign to create a three-way connection between 9/11, Iraq, and the anthrax attacks. So James Woolsey was brought in by Wolfowitz to create some kind of intelligence package that Iraq was behind the anthrax attacks. And we all know that that was complete bullshit. The Bush administration knew from the very beginning it was the AIM strain. So that everything they said after like November 2001 about it being Iraq was totally devious and form of just complete propaganda. So yeah, I mean, Wolfowitz is I think he's one of the scummiest, one of the most suspicious Bush officials, personally speaking, from my end. Yeah.
That perfectly leads into the next question. You did an interview recently with Whitney Webb at her show and Limited Hangout surrounding the 20th anniversary of the anthrax attacks. This incident was something that you and your sister Abby Martin studied intently on for months and did a timeline on Media Roots radio podcast, one of my favorites, which was Schrodinger's Super Patriot. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, Schrodinger's Super Patriot, I'll just say really quickly, if people are confused about what the title means, it's a play on the term Schrodinger's cat. The U.S. government and the FBI, in their own words, described their chosen suspect at the end of the anthrax investigation. They described him as a super patriot. And they described him that way because they believe that implied that part of the motive of why he did this. Now, what they really say, so they actually have two motives. One of the more media-approved narrative motives for the anthrax killer, who they say is Bruce Ivins, was that he was trying to get publicity for an anthrax vaccine that he helped design that wasn't being sold, and that he wanted to create a crisis in order to get people to take his anthrax vaccine. The other theory that the FBI comes up with is that he was a super patriot, and that he was so moved by 9/11 and Bush and the Bush administration that he essentially wanted to act on their behalf independently of them and go above and beyond and do his own terrorist attack because he was such a patriot, such a neocon, so pro-American, that he felt that he needed to do this in order to get people to really get on board with Bush's program. But the podcast itself you're talking about, it was us trying to basically make as cohesive as a timeline as we could, narrative timeline about the attacks and what preceded the attacks. History Commons and other places have already done this, but we wanted to try to do it in like our own original timeline. We're not just like ripping from other people's timelines, and do it in sort of a true crime narrative way where it's sort of us telling a story about, how these people died, what it was like for their loved ones who were around them at the time. Because I think in a lot of these, the anthrax attacks, it tends to get a little depersonalized when you get into the ins and outs of the case. It's good. So I think Schrodinger's cat was a good presentation for us to really humanize the event as well, to show that these were real people who died. They suffered. Their families suffered. Their families were confused. They were lied to by the government. I mean, just one of the guys who survived in Schrodinger's Super Patriot, Ernesto Blanco, I mean, he was in the hospital with anthrax, and he was pretty much in a coma for weeks. And the CDC wouldn't admit he got anthrax until like several months later. So his family didn't even get the satisfaction of being able to talk to the news about it, because like they refused to admit that he had it, and he almost died. And so, we tried to humanize these things, and we also tried to show how bizarrely the Bush administration took advantage of the attacks, and even before the attacks happened, we're already sort of laying out a propaganda track of, we think the 9/11 hijackers were going to do anthrax next. Mm-hmm. Even though Bush didn't say that outright, he sort of planted this idea in the public mind that because the hijackers were trying to rent crop dusters, that must mean that they were planning some kind of biological attack. And actually, most people don't remember this, but before anthrax, Bush actually, he didn't order the plane shot down in 9/11, but he did order a blanket ban, or not ban, but like some kind of extra protocol on crop dusters. Like you couldn't rent one for like a period of like several months unless you went through some red tape or something. You had to like jump through some extra hoops, and that was Bush's deal, based on his, this imaginary fear that there was going to be some kind of plane-based anthrax attacks. And then sort of miraculously, the Bush administration did get in their favor an anthrax attack that happened about I'm going to say 3 weeks after he started talking about crop dusters.
In 2008, the FBI requested a review of the scientific methods used in their investigation from the National Academy of Sciences, which released their findings in the 2011 report Review of the Scientific Approaches Used During the FBI's Investigation of the Anthrax Letters. And the report ended up casting doubt on the government's conclusion that Ivins was the perpetrator. You have always maintained that Ivins was not a suspect. Who do you suspect that could be?
Wow. Yeah, that's the, Adam, I think you probably know how this has worked over the years with a lot of people in the 9/11 movement and stuff. It's like suspects first and evidence later, right? It's sort of like you want to be like Cheney fucking pushed the plunger down, and blew up the bill. It's sort of like, so I guess my approach to this originally was definitely Bruce Ivins is not the suspect. Definitely, I think the Bush administration had something to do with this. I still think that, but in terms of the actual who executed the crime, how was this done, who is more likely suspect than Ivins? Well, I'll just say this. I think that it's pretty obvious based on not just the research I've done, but research that's come before me as early as even 2003. The first two Anthrax books, actually, by Marilyn Thompson and Robert Graysmith, the guy who got famous, who's portrayed by Jake Gyllenhaal in the Zodiac movie. They both say in their book, because they're writing it, before the narrative by the FBI gets sort of, let's say, massaged and, sort of whitewashed to their liking later on. The earlier narrative that the FBI was putting out was they were like telling these authors of these books, sort of behind the scenes and off the record, that their frame of looking at this case from the very beginning was a multi-person crime. Coordinated crime involving multiple people over multiple states. So that was the FBI's own belief. So I think that alone shows that they know that they're lying about only going after one suspect later on. Even if they think that they have real evidence that's maybe convincing to them that they think Bruce Ivins was involved, it's still a lie, even if they believe that, because they know that there are other people involved. And I say that because part of the research that I've done in the last 3 months is showing unequivocally that these St. Petersburg hoax anthrax letters, and people listening might have no idea what I'm talking about, but there's a researcher named Barbara Hatch Rosenberg who's essentially proved this, that there was a hoax series of letters and real letters that were sent almost at the exact same time. And they appear to be coordinated in such a way that they had to have been done by people working together, or maybe even. So I guess to answer your question is, who did it? I would say it had to have been more than one person, at least two people. I tend to think it was actually several people, a small group perhaps. I think that it was somebody who already knew 9/11 was coming, who had foreknowledge of 9/11. There's new evidence that sort of I haven't really reported on yet in the podcast and other places that suggest that the St. Petersburg letter writer was writing letters before 9/11 leading up. It was sort of like a slow burn that they, really ramped up after 9/11, but it preceded it. So there's evidence also to suggest whoever did this had foreknowledge of 9/11, which is, kind of really implies that the suspects might be in various sectors of law enforcement or maybe intelligence, or they had themselves plugged into sectors of government or somewhere that knew, had foreknowledge of 9/11. Addition to that, whoever did this, I believe, needed to be inoculated against anthrax infection. Otherwise, they would have had to be insane to put themselves at risk like that, dealing with weaponized anthrax spores. Now, what comes to mind for me, and I've argued with Whitney about this, she doesn't see the theory she doesn't see this theory as valid as I do. But I've been thinking about this a lot, and who would be, let's say, battle ready to be able to do something involving weaponized anthrax spores without wearing a hazmat suit at the drop of a hat? I would say most of the general public would not be ready to engage in a crime like that. They would have to take Cipro. Cipro takes a few days to kick in. So I've been thinking lately, and this is a theory that only recently I've come up with, is that perhaps whoever did this was already vaccinated against anthrax. So that's just one thing. I'm not giving you any names, Adam, so it's probably frustrating.
No, it's fine. Oh, no, I don't. It's fine.
But I do believe it was multiple people. I do believe that they had to have been already inoculated against anthrax to be willing to put themselves at risk like this, because handling anthrax spores is very risky. And I do believe that, it's possible that even people who did this might not have even realized they were engaging in a murder. And I know that that's going to sound a little wacky because, maybe people associate the sort of drill versus real concept with Alex Jones. But I guess, Adam, it's not that out of the realm of possibility to me that a group of younger soldiers, could have been convinced that this was some kind of anti-terror drill of some kind. And I don't know. That's a complete speculative theory I'm throwing out there. But I would say that it had to have involved people with access to high level aspects of the U.S. government or governments, because someone who procured weaponized anthrax spores and someone knew 9/11 was around the corner who was behind this. So I think those two things alone imply that it's someone with high up connections. But when I say that, I don't mean that people actually executed the crime. It could have just been, someone hired to do this. I don't know. And that's, I didn't really answer your question at all there. I'm sorry.
Absolutely not. No, I mean, I don't want, the one thing I'm very careful of is to disseminate what is true and what is not. And that's the whole basis of the podcast, is to disseminate what is true and what is not, because I think we both are well known through our experience with the truth movement that there is an enormous or saturation of disinformation where they use speculation as a form of evidence.
Yeah. Or they mix together and you can't distinguish. It's not clear where it's, where that line is.
Correct. You bring up an interesting topic, however, in the response was about the hoax letters. Very few people know about this, but in late 2001, there was a person by the name of Clayton Wagner, who was an anti-abortion activist, who mailed hundreds of anthrax hoax letters to abortion clinics in the United States. And then you had this is what you covered in the film, about the hoax letters that were sent to, of all people, Judith Miller of the New York Times in October of 2001. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I want to go back to that abortion thing really quick, because that's a really interesting part of this that I haven't covered. I mean, it does seem like that's the guy who did it, like Clayton Wagner. Yeah. But the other part, I don't know if you've read it, how much you read about that, Adam, but it's interesting because if he's behind that, it seems like he was able to he somehow got a hold of Planned Parenthood's like FedEx account number or something, and like managed to send. The amount of letters that he sent was pretty ridiculous. And part of me wonders if there was someone copycatting or sort of piggybacking off of that. Like, this crazy anti-abortion guy did this. And then, because if you read the amount of letters that actually went out and who they went out to, it was actually pretty insane. Like the amount of resources whoever was behind that spent on doing that. But it's like, there's so many anthrax hoaxes throughout time, even before 9/11, that it didn't occur to me to actually look into any of these specifically and be like, is this important to the anthrax crime? Because how are you going to, there's thousands of them, really. I mean, especially when you go after 9/11, it almost becomes a meme. It's like, people sending white powder to their friends as pranks, was something that people would do. So,
he sent, by the way, he sent 550 letters to FedEx.
Yeah. Amazing. And somehow he got a hold of what I guess that was a weird thing to me, is somehow he got a hold of Planned Parenthood's FedEx account number and managed to like buy postage like using their own money. So it was a weird thing that was pulled off. But the Judith Miller hoax letter is the one that stood out to me, Adam, because if people, I don't know if listeners of your program are already aware of this, but Judith Miller wasn't just someone who took a fall for a Bush official, to not reveal him as the source during that whole weird Valerie Plame affair, which is a weird ball of yarn to unpack in and of itself. But Judith Miller was the bioweapons reporter. She was the expert leading bioweapons reporter in the country. She was basically anybody on the inside who wanted to leak something to her about bioweapons, or, tell her about a new exciting, mutant enhanced strain of whatever, they would tell her and have her write about it in the New York Times. And she was actually friends with Bill Patrick, who is sort of considered the godfather of modern U.S. bioweapons program, along with people like Ken Alabek, who sort of was one of his proteges. Bill Patrick was actually a suspect initially in the case, and he was polygraphed by the FBI, and he passed. Now, Whitney, I don't know if she believes he's directly a suspect, but she has a lot of writings about how insane he used to talk about bioweapons. I mean, he would throw like vials of white powder at people and be like, if this was anthrax, you'd be dead right now. And like, he would do just weird stuff like that all the time to try to teach people about bioweapons. But Judith Miller, this hoax letter that was sent to her from St. Petersburg always stood out to me because she describes it in her article title as a cloud of powder, sort of being attacked by a cloud of powder. Now, I think I even made this mistake in Schrodinger's Patriot, where I was under the impression that several of the real anthrax letters let out sort of a powdery cloud in the air, and that was part of the visual imagery of people's experience opening the real anthrax letters. But what I've discovered going back through all this is that it's actually not. The real anthrax letters, except for the Dasha letter, because I do think that one was a very fine white powder. But before that, Adam, that image of a white cloud of powder being like the delivery method for weaponized anthrax wars, that comes from Judith Miller's hoax letter, talcum powder. Because if you have a little pile of talcum powder and you blow on it, it's going to go in the air. It's going to look like it's, kind of floating in the air. So that whole visual image of this, cloud of weaponized anthrax spores, you breathing it in and you're seeing it in the room, that comes from Judith Miller getting the hoax anthrax letter. But what's really, really weird is the very first anthrax letter in the entire timeline. So you go back to the first anthrax infection, Erin O'Connor of NBC News, who was an aide to Tom Brokaw. She got anthrax sometime around the 25th. She started to get sick. She calls the FBI along with NBC's management around the 25th to say, we got this suspicious letter. It has white powder in it. It looks like anthrax. Can you come and check this out? For some reason, they wait 2 days to come and check it out. In the meantime, she starts getting sick. So she goes to the hospital. And while in the hospital, they conduct a test on her wound. She has a wound. And they find out that it's cutaneous skin anthrax infection. Now, the FBI at this time contact her. They now have the letter. They're getting it tested at their lab. And they're talking to her, they're asking her about the St. Petersburg letter, because in their mind and in her mind, this St. Petersburg letter that got sent to Tom Brokaw, that I should say for your audience, had fake anthrax and it had talcum powder in it. She believed, and the FBI believed, this was her delivery of infection. This is how she got infected. Well, it turns out a few days later, the FBI calls her and they say, you know what? That letter that we have tested negative for anthrax. We don't understand. We know you have anthrax, but the letter that you gave us tested negative. Is there any other possibility you could have gotten this in some other way? So after she picks her brain a bit, she's like, you know what? There was another letter that I got, but I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but I filed it away. And I remembered it had something that looked like sand in it. So the FBI goes back. They ask the janitor, I guess, of the building to go and look for it. And the janitor immediately finds the real letter that everybody had forgotten existed. The one that said death to Israel, death to America, Allah is great. Somehow Erin O'Connor had forgotten about that until weeks later when the FBI jogged her memory and asked her, is there anything else, that you could have gotten in the mail? So in her mind, the hoax letter from St. Petersburg that had the talcum powder left more of an impression on her, and she believed that's how she got sick. But in fact, the FBI is claiming that it wasn't from that letter, that was a hoax. But the real anthrax letter was the one that infected her, that had a sandy-like material in it. Now, I should also mention that these letters, the hoax letter from St. Petersburg was postmarked September 20th. The hoax letter from the real anthrax letter from Trenton, New Jersey, that actually apparently infected her, that one was sent out on September 18th. So nowhere in the news at all was there any information about an anthrax attack until October 5th. And even then, the government wouldn't admit it was bioterrorism. They still said that Robert Stevens may have, drinking some water from a stream or something, and that's how he got anthrax. So, I mean, I guess to make a long story short here, the FBI's investigation of the Amerithrax attacks actually started with a hoax letter from St. Petersburg, not a real letter.
And yet, the government tried to tie this in with Iraq, and which I want to get your thoughts on this, because I think this is the hint of irony in all of this, is that even incidentally, for the years prior to September 11th, the U.S. government had criticized the Iraqi government for possessing chemical and biological weapons when they used against Iran in 1980 in the war. However, according to Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector in Iraq from 91 to 98, he said in an interview in 2002 that by 1998, 90 to 95% of Iraq's nuclear, biological, and chemical capabilities, including long-range ballistic missiles of delivering such weapons, have been verified as destroyed. With the verification that Iraq had no biological or chemical weapons, it now comes down to the faulty intelligence that we spoke about the White House and Colin Powell with his speech at the National Security Council, which precipitated the war in 2003. I'd like to get your thoughts overall on that.
It's remarkable, Adam, because when you really look at this timeline, it's hard to make sense of it, because, if you learn that the anthrax was such a pivotal, or was used as such a strong talking point to get us into Iraq, and you think to yourself, okay, well, what is Robbie really saying here? He's saying that they use the anthrax attacks, letter attacks, to create all this hysteria and fear, and then use it as a ramp to get us into Iraq. But, well, Robbie's wrong, because they were already going after Stephen Hadfield in 2003 before April. They had already, the FBI already put out a profile as early as 2002 saying, we think it's basically like a Unabomber style dude. So here you have the FBI, kind of quietly, but, still a little bit publicly saying they thought it was an inside job. And they thought it was someone with access to U.S. bioweapons. But then you have this other track going in the media that's actually getting more attention, that's alluding that it's Iraq possibly. And you have people like John McCain going on David Letterman, which is crazy, really, that he said that he thinks the next stage is Iraq, and that Saddam sent there's good information out there that Saddam sent the anthrax. And Dave Letterman's like, oh, really? He's like taking it all seriously. And then you have, and this is what I think is actually really clever of the Bush administration, Adam. And I think this is where people's historical lens of Bush is distorted based on something that kind of they wanted you to think at the time, which is that they were idiots, that Bush was an idiot, that they were incompetent. They were so dumb they couldn't even think to plant WMDs in Iraq so that they could be like, you know what? Look, we were right. They did find WMDs. There's all these sort of narratives out there that they were just dumb and incompetent, and daddy made him go to war and all this stuff. It's like, here's the reality of the WMD thing. They didn't give a shit if we found WMDs or not there, because they knew it was just a reason to get us to go over there. They didn't care. They knew that once we were there, what were people going to say? Oh, you didn't find WMDs, now you have to leave? No, they didn't care at all. So that's the reality of the WMDs thing. And not to mention that WMDs was always a metonym code for anthrax from the very beginning of when they used it. It was never meant really to talk about nukes or nerve gas. That was thrown in later. It was always meant to insinuate anthrax, because the Bush administration was clever enough never to directly come out and say, we think that. They never said, we think Al-Qaeda did this. They never came out and said, we think Saddam might be behind this. They left it open-ended on purpose. Like Bush said, this is terrorism. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization, and I wouldn't put anything past them. Dick Cheney would come out and make certain statements like that where we can't rule out that this is Al-Qaeda. They never were dumb enough to say on record that they thought it was Saddam. But what they did was they actually had all their sort of neoconservative allies outside of the administration do that for them in the press. And they did it extremely well. I mean, they started right after the anthrax attacks, all the way until the Iraq War, and even after. Even though the FBI was already looking at a lone scientist in the US, even though the FBI already established it was AIM strain, even though everybody in the Bush administration obviously knew all these things because they had been briefed by the FBI, it didn't matter. They still got all their neoconservative allies to pump this narrative that it had the anthrax had bentonite in it, which was a hallmark of Iraq's WMD program, or that Muhammad Atta met with so-and-so in Prague, or you probably know more about that incident where he was talking about how to get anthrax, and even some neocons were still pushing the idea that the hijackers were trying to rent crop dusters. Some of the research that I've gone into in my recent podcast about how there's weird crossover between the hijackers and anthrax. And then Ari Fleischer put the kibosh on it finally. It was like once the Bush administration already gotten into Iraq, had already gotten their surrogates to go out there and lie, Ari Fleischer finally comes out and says there's no connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq with the anthrax attacks, after we're already in Iraq, of course. And after he says that, there's still a weird neocon faction that is still trying to push the Iraq did anthrax narrative. And specifically, the one who was leading that charge was oddly Mike Pence back in 2006. And Ari Fleischer actually much later argued with him, I think on Twitter about it or something. He's like, I told you that I was like, you were still going out there and saying this. And I don't know, it's weird. But basically the Bush administration, I think, was very clever in the way that they rolled this out. They never directly said Saddam was behind it, but they got the public to believe he was, with a lot of really clever and frequent insinuations, to the point where I think it just sort of primed people's minds, so that once they saw that Colin Powell speech, they understood all the subtext. They understood it. Colin Powell only references the anthrax mailings once, and he says 1 teaspoon, or he's like, a quarter of a teaspoon was in that envelope that was sent to Tom Brokaw. He's like, Iraq has 40,000 teaspoons or something like that, and it's like, so he doesn't say Iraq did it. He doesn't say we have evidence, we think that it was done by a foreign terrorist. He just makes that sort of psychological connection. And I think that was enough. And I really do think that it was like, I don't know if the Bush administration had psychologists learning how to do this, but there was a cleverness to it that I think is not really discussed, that I think that they knew how to weave this without exposing themselves to being like caught on microphone saying something that was blatantly fictional. It was a more clever way to weave this, and there's Colin Powell, the man who represents this bipartisan trustworthiness. It was meant for liberals. That's the reason why they put him out there. He was a trustworthy guy, and and then also, Adam, I mean, Wilkerson helped him write that speech, and I'm still annoyed that he hasn't answered for that either. And when Abby asked him about it, he acted like just he had no idea what she was talking about. And to me, that's one of the greatest crimes of the Bush administration, is that they used the anthrax attacks to whip people up into hysteria, and still sort of insinuated that it was a foreign attack until it was no longer convenient to do so. And then they just sort of, forget about that narrative. Like, what's Bruce Ivins? Here we're in Iraq. Like, we're already, we're here. So that's kind of what they did with it.
Just to revisit too, back to your film, American Anthrax, we know that the disinformation came from the State Department, but there was another entity that was just as guilty in spreading that disinformation. You mentioned in the film that the legacy media started to spread the unverified rumors that the manufactured anthrax was from Iraq.
Yeah.
However, in late October, ABC's Brian Ross said that despite continued White House denials, 4 placed in separate sources told ABC News that initial tests on the anthrax by the U.S. Army at Fort Detrick have detected trace amounts of the chemical additives bentonite and silica, the same anthrax type sent to Daschle and Leahy, who you mentioned, who ironically just moved the force to vote on Senate regarding the Iraq war measure on the House in 2002. Now, 2 questions here for you. It seemed the White House was trying to get the public approval for war by spreading disinformation about anthrax through the media, and was Daschle specifically targeted because he was against the war in Iraq?
Good questions. I mean, as you're saying that, Adam, I think that the Bush administration was, like, again, I think they were a little more clever than people give them credit for. And I wonder if this was also a game for them, that because it could imply multiple things here. It could imply that there was a neocon faction or a faction that was really wanting to pin this on Iraq, but there was a faction in the Bush administration that wanted to put the kibosh on that. That's sort of what it seems like on the surface, that Ari Fleischer is trying to shut this down while Brian Ross is out there running with this ABC News leak from 4, like you said, 4 separate well-placed officials. Well, what if it was done on purpose? What if, and this is speculation, but what if Ari Fleischer, what if they wanted that to go out on ABC? Continuing sort of that, we're not going to say Iraq's behind this, but we're going to have people do it in the press. And then we're going to sit here and officially deny it. But, Brian Ross is still going to do it. I don't know. I mean, I wonder if that's the case, because who were those 4 well-placed officials? Were they more neocon than, Ari Fleischer? Were they part of the Wolfowitz faction? I really don't know. And I think that's still a mystery why the Bush administration played it the way that they did, and why they didn't jump at the opportunity at the times that they could have to really hype up and whip up hysteria about anthrax, because they actually waited at least a week to identify the first anthrax attack as bioterrorism, which is, I think, one of the strangest things they ever did. I mean, of all the things they jumped on and hyped up and fearmongered us about, that one, they waited a week and were really sort of wanting to make sure they knew for sure that it was terrorism and not random. I mean, that just doesn't sound right to me with the way the Bush administration behaved, So that's still an odd mystery to me why they waited on that. And then later John Ashcroft finally lets the FBI go in there, but maybe that's why. Maybe they knew that, let's just say they had something to do with it. Maybe they didn't want the FBI in there for a week for a specific reason. So I don't know.
Do you think Daschle was specifically targeted because of his position against the Iraq war?
I don't think it was because of the Iraq war. I think the Patriot Act theory adds up because him and Leahy were actually asking for a delay on the vote. A lot of earlier sort of anthrax researchers would sort of oversimplify this and say they were against the Patriot Act. Well, I mean, if you really look at their record, they were pretty neoliberal centrist guys who took some caution about the rushed Patriot Act. And I think that alone agitated whoever this murderer or murderers were enough to target them specifically. It was merely just the asking for a little bit of a delay that was upsetting enough. So yeah, I think Daschle could have been targeted over that. But if I really go back and think about it, I would say there were more aggressively anti-Iraq war people that I think really posed more of a threat. So I don't know if that was the motive. I mean, like if I go back and watch, for example, Lincoln Chaffee grilling Wolfowitz or other Bush officials, I mean, like you would think if they were trying to target the most anti-Iraq war or anti-war people, and that they would have targeted someone like him or Kucinich. So I don't know. I mean, it's possible, but I know Daschle was not the most I'm pretty sure he voted for a lot of the supplementals and stuff. Like I don't know his actual, his actual record later on. Like did he vote? Did he even not vote for it initially? I wonder.
I think initially he was against. at
Okay.
first,
Yeah.
but it was almost an overwhelming vote.
I should also say, Adam, and I don't know if people, some of your audience probably knows this, is he actually, I think it's possible he was attacked because he admitted and he let it out there that Bush and Cheney were badgering him to not investigate 9/11. Like that comes to mind to me too, because it's like, I mean, that is a pretty crazy thing to basically try to convince a senator of, and the fact that he said it was pretty ballsy on his part. I mean, I don't know if he really realized what he was saying at the time, honestly. I mean, you really look at the whole thing, that's a pretty that's pretty revealing, thing to let out there. The Bush administration was intimidating him out of doing any form of investigation. I'm talking about the Congressional Joint Inquiry into 9/11.
Right. The interesting you brought up the Patriot Act, because it was Ashcroft who pressured the bipartisan compromise in the House Judiciary Committee, which allowed for legislation for the Patriot Act to move forward with full consideration later that month, and it was formally announced on October 25th, 2001. And I think that was basically because of the Anthrax attacks.
It's so crazy because, yeah, like the Anthrax attacks were going on while they were trying to pass the Patriot Act. Like if you read stories at the time, there was actually like people got locked in. Like I think when it first happened, there were actually people locked in, and then they quarantined the building, and then people were basically locked out. So there were some times during that where, like, I read stories where people were like cutting and pasting with a glue stick, like putting together and revising the bill because they couldn't have access to their computers or certain printers. There was all this weird activity, where they were scurrying to try to construct this bill and get it passed as soon as possible. And then I guess what I was trying to say is also the Afghanistan war was also like launching at the same time. So imagine the flurry of media coverage and how much that also sort of buried the Anthrax attacks. It's like, it's actually hard to find people really focusing on the Anthrax attacks like they should have been because of the amount of activity simply happening at that time. I mean, the Afghanistan war took up an enormous amount of media coverage. They had the graphics and the spinning flags and everything. It was a full on like CGI, show in a way at the time.
All right. We're switching gears. In January of 2001, the security branch of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency began to receive a number of peculiar reports from DEA officers across the country. In fact, reports came in from more than 40 cities and continued throughout the first 6 months of 2001. Agents of the DEA, ATF, Air Force, Secret Service, FBI, and even the U.S. Marshal Service documented some 130 separate incidents. This was otherwise known as the Israeli art student ring. You have focused on this intently over the last months. Tell us a little bit more. What made you take an interest in this operation?
Well, I had already heard about it. I mean, I already heard, years the dancing Israelis, the urban moving system stuff. It became sort of a bone of contention in the 9/11 movement for a lot of people because it became sort of this, factionalized thing where it's like people saying like the Mossad did 9/11, where all they wanted to talk about was the 4 Israelis and urban moving systems, and then people who were really mad at anybody bringing that up and said like you're just trying to make it all about that. And so that was sort of that's really all I knew. I knew a little bit about the art students like concept, but I actually didn't know anything about it until a buddy of mine, John Gold, who's been doing 9/11 research for 20 years. He had a comment on his Facebook page by a guy, and I recognized the guy's name. It was Emmanuel Spherios, and I recognized him from the psychedelic drug community, which I was already familiar with from my early college days. Emmanuel Spherios was actually a sort of a semi-famous figure within that movement when I came into it, because Emmanuel Spherios was part of what I would say was like a really good public service that was sort of going against the DEA at the time. The DEA and the government's attitude was we basically turn any drug user into a criminal. That's still their attitude. If you use drugs, illegal drugs, you are a criminal. In terms of, the talk of drug treatment being an option for people who get arrested for drug crimes in the US, that's really only a topic that came more normalized after 9/11. You know, it's like that's more of a modern thing we can talk about. Back when Emmanuel was doing this, he was basically making sure people didn't die, because his theory, and he lays this out on my podcast, he thinks the DEA and the government were actually propping up drug dealers who were flooding the market with basically poisonous ecstasy and using that as an excuse to lie about the dangers of ecstasy, MDMA. And I think you can read a lot about this, and there is, I think, good evidence that this is how the DEA has operated a lot over time, is they will sort of pick a certain specific sector of the black market that's distributing basically an adulterated form of the drug and say the drug itself is poison. When in MDMA's case, MDMA is, there's been a lot of studies on it. It really hasn't been shown to have any neurotoxic effects or anything like that. But what happened at the time was it was known as something that you can instantly die from taking. So his business idea was, and it wasn't to make money, it was as a public service, to go to raves, go to popular spots where kids are doing ecstasy, and set up actual chemistry testing kits to make sure people didn't die from taking adulterated ecstasy. So people would line up at these raves, kids, before they would take their pills, would bring it to his booth, and he had a lot of volunteers working for him at the time, and they would actually do like a real-time, like almost like a drug test kit you can buy now at like Walgreens. They would test the pill to see if it was pure MDMA or what else it had in it, and they probably saved thousands of lives, honestly, at the time. I mean, for what he was doing. So for some reason, this attracted the attention of what he thought was the DEA coming to visit his unlisted private office suite address in a building in San Francisco. And this organization that he ran was called dancesafe.org. They had branches all around the country now. He definitely knew that he was being watched by federal law enforcement. Anybody in any realm of illegal drug advocacy at the time was being watched by DEA. It was just sort of like, you just knew that that was how it was, because there was a very small amount of people. The feds were watching you. Even you go to any event and it was like, it wasn't even paranoid to be like, yeah, there's feds here. Like, don't talk about where to buy drugs. Like, not like, we're just here as academics and there's feds here waiting for one of us to slip up so that they can take this down, take this organization down, essentially. So he thought the DEA had taken an interest in him enough to send basically like spies to his office. Because one day in 1999, a group of kids in their early 20s knocked on his private office suite door in San Francisco, an address that wasn't really listed anywhere. It wasn't like a door-to-door salesman would be walking through the building going office to office. But these people who came to his door claimed to be door-to-door salesmen selling art. And the conversation was already suspicious to him because he figured these were feds in his mind. He's like, these guys have to be DEA. Why are they here? And he was convinced that he had just interacted with feds because they started to ask him about ecstasy and MDMA. And he's like, well, these people obviously know what we do here, and this is really sketchy, and I'm going to tell them to leave. Because at that point he's like, I'm going to see what this is. This seems suspicious that these feds are talking to me. But then as soon as they started asking him about drugs, he's like, no. Like, this is really suspicious. So he told them to leave. Years later, he reads Christopher Ketchum's stuff, I think in Salon. And he's like, I was visited by Israeli art students. Like, this wasn't feds or DA. This is exactly what happened to me. These two guys came to my office, suspiciously slow. No one ever visited our office. Unsolicited, door-to-door salesmen. And they said they were from the University of, I don't know, where's the university they used to say they were from? Starts with a K, I think. I forget. But imaginary art university. He remembered the name. He even remembered the portfolios they carried around. And he remembers them being like a pair, which is often, for some reason, they would often come in pairs. And, he read about all this in Christopher Ketchum's article about the Israeli art students. And he was like, I was visited by the goddamn Israeli art students. So it wasn't American feds that visited me. It was like Israeli spies. And that just threw him for a loop because he was trying to figure out what that meant, why Israeli spies would have visited him, because, it already doesn't make very much sense when you look at the DEA report, because it's like they visited DEA officials, they visited DEA officials' homes, they visited DEA chemists' homes, like lab technicians at the DEA. They would like go find out like where they lived and go visit them at their home. So to him, he's like, well, it must have had something to do with drugs, because, you know, if they're going to visit DEA, they're coming to visit me. Maybe there's something here where he was thinking the Israeli intelligence was plugged into the American black market of the E-trade here. And there's some evidence to suggest with Amdocs, especially, that probably was happening on some level. But it's like, it's obviously like a tiny slice of what was actually happening. It's like a tip of the iceberg, I guess I would say, of what that actually was. Because, I mean, frankly, Adam, I really don't know what it was other than a distraction of some kind. I mean, that's, you know, it seemed like probably the best explanation. But again, it's a convoluted mystery to me still, but it obviously relates to things like the E-trade, 9/11 even. I mean, even just from my map, putting together this map research project, you know, in the DEA memo, they talk about these Israeli art students being really close to and trying to track down chemists who work for the DEA. Well, it seems like some of these Israeli art students were also really close to Battelle, which is a U.S. government contractor that deals in biological materials and does a lot of chemistry. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know why they were there. I'm sure you have some theories. But in Florida specifically, Adam, it does seem like they were there shadowing 9/11 hijackers at times. And that's pretty hard that theory, I think, is pretty hard to dispute. The timeline is very close. The geographical locations are very close. And even the apparatus of how these Israeli art students groups supposedly work, where they had a cell ringleader and underlings working under them. Well, same kind of thing with the hijacker. The leader, you know, apparently Muhammad Atta was the leader. He had some of his underlings living in an apartment complex next to a team leader of Israeli art students and his underlings. So it's just kind of strange how all those things sort of line up together. You know, what does it mean? Why would they have been tracking the 9/11 hijackers? I couldn't tell you, but it seems like that's what they were doing. Or I don't know. Did they actually interact with them at a certain point? We don't have any proof of that, but it's possible. You know, I really don't know though.
Yeah, there seems to be too many coincidences regarding this, and this is something that's also mentioned in a document I think I shared with you a while back called the Gerald Shea Memo, where the retired lawyer out of Chicago actually did an independent investigation regarding the Israeli art students and moving front companies. And incidentally enough, you saw connections, and he laid it out with names and that was coming from the arrest reports of the local police, where you saw a number of these art student individuals living precariously close to where Muhammad Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, and even where Ziad Jarrah lived. And Jarrah lived separately from Atta and Shehi. It just seemed, for me, it's just like, you can't, and I'm like you, where you can't make that connection that they were there for them, but when there was smoke, there's fire. And I'm like, it's too close to home for me to say that this is all just a coincidence, because it's not only in Florida, but it's also in New Jersey, and it's also in New York. And well, later I found out that some of them even lived near Khalid Ahmedar and Nawaf al-Hazmi out west. And really, it just, when you really think about it, it's just like, I hate to sound like a broker. I'm like you, where I can't make that solid connection that they knew, but they were there at the right times, wherever they were, and just too close. That's what I think, anyway.
No, I mean, I think it's also good to look at this from the angle of whoever these art students were, they were given almost no cover story that could hold up under screen. And that to me is really odd, because if we're looking at this as, was this a distraction or meant to waste resources? Then, you know, you kind of have to wonder, like, why didn't they have better cover stories? Were they meant to just get blown immediately and then, you know, waste resources of the DEA? It's very confusing. And I also am curious too, like, why I guess I would like to see pictures of all these people. Did any of them, let's just throw out a completely wacky theory. Did any of them look anything like any of the hijackers? Let's just say. I mean, is that possible that maybe any of these art students who are in Florida look kind of like one of the hijackers? I don't know. I don't know what that would mean if they did, but I just think it's curious that we don't have pictures of any of these people. Maybe they're out there, but there was another really crazy document that I didn't realize existed until like 4 months ago called the Fin List. And I'm sure you and DJ are already familiar with this, and I didn't realize the origin of where this document came from either, but apparently it's either Finnish intelligence or Dutch intelligence. You know which one it was?
I want to say it was Finnish. Well, I haven't looked at this. You just reminded me because I have it saved in bookmarks. I have not looked at this document in a long time. Well,
the guy you're talking about, the lawyer, includes it in his report as one of the exhibits. But in his report, unfortunately, it's not in text form. It's like almost like a bitmap screen cap of it. So you can barely, some of the addresses you can barely read in the document you're referring to with the maps. Right, now, I found the original PDF, so if you don't have it, I can send it to you. It's all, all readable.
Yeah, please.
But what's fascinating about this is apparently this was accidentally left up on a public website by a European intelligence. I want to say Finnish or Dutch. I'm not sure. And it was given to them by U.S. federal agencies. That's the story. So what that means is these U.S. federal agencies were sharing a giant list with 9/11 suspects and Israeli art students on the same list. Why would they be doing that? I mean, you have to ask that question. Why would they think they belonged on the same list? I mean, I think that's a really important question to ask. Because if they thought they should be on the same list, then that kind of implies they thought they had some link to 9/11 or some, because there's a lot of, I should say, when I say link to 9/11, there's a lot of suspects on the Fin List that some of them are just like white European guys. Like there's a lot of people in this web that they were trying to construct. So, and that includes people like, I want to say, what's his name? Francois Boselic, the Belgian terrorist guy who was mysteriously, like the FBI was looking at this guy like right after 9/11 because he was like a Belgian terrorist that had somehow fled to the United States and had gotten like immunity here. Like no one was able to touch him here. I don't know. Anyways, the Fin List is fascinating. And that's basically I was like, okay, here I have basically 100, 300 addresses. I'll just plug all these into a map and see what happens. And that's how the maps, the Florida event attacks map that I put together started. Was it just like, I just plopped all those onto the map. And as soon as I did, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is like, I can build on this and just, why not add a layer of anthrax suspects and locations and different, addresses to this map because, they were already saying, that there's some kind of weird connection between the hijackers and the anthrax attacks. And there is weird proximity to where the hijackers were to where the anthrax attacks happened. I mean, that's another thing that, just like you're saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. With this, there's something happening here that I cannot quite explain because I don't think the hijackers did anthrax. I mean, they couldn't have because they died before. I mean, they wouldn't have been able to. Someone else would have had to send those letters even if they were somehow involved in that. But, that was the narrative that the Bush administration was trying to build upon really early on. So I wonder what that means and why there are so many weird connections there. And then one of the strangest ones of all is that Robert Stevens, the first anthrax victim's boss, Mike Irish at the Sun, which was one of the trashier tabloids out of American Media Inc. It was the one where by the late 90s, early 2000s was all Dead Sea Scrolls, Nostradamus, biblical prophecies stuff at the grocery store aisle. So Mike Irish, his boss, his editor, his wife was Gloria Irish. And the FBI actually questioned Gloria Irish initially, thinking that she might be a potential suspect. They actually would put out public statements saying they called her in the middle of the night. And I think when the FBI calls you at like 1 a.m, kind of means they're not really being courteous to you at the very least. And it's also a little bit of a way to throw you off. Like, I don't think the FBI call any, I mean, maybe they called a lot of people at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. The fact that they called Gloria Irish at 1 a.m. to grill her about her interactions with the 9/11 hijackers and showing them apartment buildings, I think is interesting. And you can also see the way they talked about her and her husband. They were kind of almost trying to Stephen Hatfieldize her at first, and then they backed off. But basically, the reason why her and her husband are suspicious is because Robert Stevens' boss, at AMI, he dies from anthrax. Robert Stevens does. And Gloria Irish is just coincidentally was showing hijackers apartments leading up to the 9/11 attacks. And she actually procured 2 apartment buildings for some of the hijackers. And she's also got, and that's the only thing I knew about it, is that she showed apartment buildings to 2, or sorry, I think it was 2 hijackers, and she got them apartments. She also, on my map, what I found is, looking through public records, is that her and her husband have all these other bizarre linkages, proximity, closeness to completely different hijackers. So if she was only showing, let's say, well, if she was, in proximity close to all the same hijackers she was showing apartments to, maybe that would make sense. But the fact that her and her husband keep popping up on this map so close to all the other hijackers at completely different times, I think is a little bit odd. And it does kind of raise questions about, was there another, let's just say, we already know Huffman Aviation, some of this stuff Daniel Hopsicker's pulled out about 9/11 in Florida. Some of these companies seem like fronts or conduits for black ops things. Huffman Aviation would advertise outside the United States to foreign nationals to teach them flying. And when these foreign nationals would come to Huffman Aviation to take flying lessons, they would then say, we can also get you an apartment. We have like 5 people in the area that, can get you an apartment. So it's like this little network of people, was this perhaps some kind of conduit for black ops? This whole thing, I don't know. Was Gloria Irish, an actual conduit for something like that? I don't know either. But again, where there's smoke, there's fire. These things just have not been properly investigated, I think. And I think besides people like Graham McQueen and, Ketchum and some of these other people have really tried to follow the threads of the Israeli art students, it's just kind of been ignored. And people like you are still talking about it, but it's, we simply, it just sort of, at a certain point we hit a wall, and it's just like, what does all this stuff actually mean? It means something, but
Yeah, I agree. It's just like it almost is compounded also because of the fringe conspiracists that arise and basically have taken the steam away from a proper investigation into this as well. The no planes and no hijackers and all this stuff. However, you brought up a very important podcast. I've been back in 2019. It was entitled, I remember, it was Ecstasy Israeli Art Students and the Mossad, where you spoke at length about the drug ring of the Israeli Mossad. What did you uncover there?
Well, I mean, actually, DJ Thermal Detonator helped me out. He had more information about pre-existing news stories about Israeli nationals or government-related people who, were involved in ecstasy. I guess I can't take credit for uncovering anything personally there, but I thought probably the most intriguing thing goes all the way back to Amdocs and how Amdocs was this really big company that was doing like the phone logs for all the major telephone companies, yet they were actively, and the DA memo talks about this, they believe they were actively blowing sting operations where the DEA would get to a major, they would surveil, they would keep tabs on a major drug deal about to happen, and then when they would go to raid the location, it would be emptied out, cleaned out, like someone had gotten the jump on them, and in their eyes, someone did, and the only explanation they could come up with was it must have been Amdocs, this Israeli company that they also thought had links to the Mossad and Israeli intelligence. So that's the strange sort of tie-in with the Israeli art students, is they're talking about both of these different things happening sort of unrelated to each other. Now, maybe there was a direct connection between Amdocs and students. I don't remember ever reading about it, but yeah, the actual ecstasy trade involving Israeli nationals, I mean, it sort of was a cultural meme. I mean, like I even went back and watched, there was like a movie with Jesse Eisenberg, and he was a rabbi, and his friend and him were rabbis in the movie, and they sort of got involved in an ecstasy smuggling ring. And I was like, is this bullshit? Is this like something that actually was, did it really happen? And apparently it was like a really big deal that rabbis were being used as drug mules. like Orthodox rabbi, like in the full get up, were being used as actual ecstasy mules a lot, back in the ecstasy trade. And yeah, I mean, I know that most of the ecstasy was distributed through Israel at one time. It was actually manufactured mostly in Eastern Europe and sort of imported through Israel and then distributed to the rest of the world through there. But you probably actually know more than me, Adam, about actual ties to the Israeli government with, if there are like direct ties.
Yeah,
I mean, like there was a politician who got in trouble, right, for being. I mean, I forget his name though. There was like I remember there was an Israeli politician who was involved in some ecstasy deal at one time, but I don't know.
There was I have to give credit to DJ as well. He told me about the story about Cookie Ogren and his links to Heidi Fleiss and the drug ring through him. And I had no idea who Cookie Ogren was. No idea. He was such an influential major figure in the drug trade in the United States, not just in New York, that, and this was about 3 years ago, so my memory is short. And yeah, he told me about that story, and I had no idea he had such a major influence. Yet the guy just dropped off the face of the earth. You never heard from him again. And it just seems that way with all the Israeli nationals that were involved pre and post 9/11. The art student ring, never hear a name, don't know a picture, as you said. Moving front companies, urban moving systems. In fact, I heard one of the movers actually, he got married on September 11th in 2002. So there's that to deal with. You don't know where these people are, where they went. It's just like almost like the Saudis too. This is something I found through my years of reading and studying these two foreign intelligence rings, was that all of them were deported back to their home countries before the congressional inquiries, and all at the same with the same infraction, overstaying their visas. All these people had expired visas. It was almost like we're going to get you out of the country on a crime, but the crime is not severe enough where the federal government is not going to use the Department of Justice. We're just going to use the INS to move you out of the country. And so the FBI, I remember the FBI actually, when they were transporting the bin Laden family out of Massachusetts and Kentucky, and all these Saudi royals, the FBI was basically saying, we still have more questions for these people, but they wanted to get them out of the country. And that came straight from the top, George Bush and the White House. In fact, there's an infamous picture, you've probably seen it, Robbie, where Bandar bin Sultan is at like this promenade with Dick Cheney, George Bush, and somebody else, maybe Condoleezza Rice. And it was stated that they were talking about the upcoming response to the attacks, and as well as getting the Saudis out of the country before they're even properly vetted. And it just seems with the Israelis, there's a lot more questions than answers. But my next question for you is somebody we both share in common, a general dislike for this individual, even when he was the police commissioner here in New York. During his tenure as the interior minister of Iraq, which was appointed to him by Bush, Bernard Kerik secretly accepted and failed to report a $250,000 interest-free loan from none other than Israeli billionaire Eitan Wertheimer in 2005, in which the contents of the loan was never made known. Nobody knows why he was given this loan. But just weeks prior to 9/11, Kerik incidentally makes a trip to Israel, where he was with the police commission when he was the police commissioner in New York, in the hopes of receiving some advice about the ecstasy drug ring and how to combat them in New York. Can you talk more about these issues?
Well, you're teaching me something in real time, Adam. I didn't even hear that last part. I knew that he went to Israel, but I didn't know it was for that. So
that's why I saved that question for last. I figured
that for a second. I'll talk about what I do know about Bernard Kerik, because that I'll just let that one sit, because that's crazy. But Bernard Kerik is a really interesting figure, because you just look at him and he screams. I mean, maybe this is gonna show my coastal elitist attitude, but he screams mobster to me. Like, he just looks like he's a mobster. Okay. Yes. And you have to understand too, he was plugged into all of the Department of Corrections, all across the East Coast. Everybody knew him. I mean, if he's not officially mobbed up, he essentially, in a way, can operate like a kind of a mob, string puller. I mean, imagine the amount of criminal connections and informants and people that, he knew just from his time in the NYPD and through the Department of Corrections. And then the clout that he built up through 9/11, being there, by Rudy's side. But yeah, it's really weird that why did Bernard Kerik, what was it about Bernard Kerik that the Bush administration, that George W. Bush personally wanted to nominate him for being the head of Homeland Security? What was it about Kerik that they loved so much that they wanted to reward him with that job? That's really strange to me. But I don't. There was something about this Israeli bribe that he took from this businessman that messed up his chances. I mean, he went to jail for that, didn't he? Yes,
that's right.
So that messed up his career in a way. But he actually, this is a weird thing, is he stepped down. He had to be actually, I cannot accept this nomination because I hired an illegal immigrant to be my be my maid or something, which seems kind of weird to me that that would be enough, that would be enough of a controversy to get someone like him knocked out of the running. I mean, I don't think it would have actually hurt. I mean, I think he would have been fine. So it was weird that kind of got aired out there as a reason why he had to step down. And then Tom Ridge, of course, gets in the slot, but then he gets appointed by Rumsfeld. So he gets tapped by another Bush official who says, you know what? This guy, Bernard Kerik, he'd be perfect for serving under Paul Bremer, the head of, what's the company? I'm missing the name. Kroll Associates.
Kroll, right.
The head of Kroll Associates, who's already the governor, occupying governor of Iraq. It'd be great to have Bernard Kerik be the vice governor of Iraq, and then also it'd be great to have him train the Iraqi police. So that's, for some reason, they hired Bernard Kerik to be that in Iraq. And, he takes credit for keeping Iraq stable. He'll still take credit for that. That it's after he basically had to leave and shut down his Iraqi police project is when everything fell apart, and that's why ISIS came to be. But he's such a strange character to me, Adam, because he actually pushes what I guess you could call kind of truthery conspiracies nowadays. And he's actually, I've seen people in the 9/11 truth movement promoting Bernard Kerik recently, and it's really interesting because it's Bernard Kerik does promote stuff like January 6th was the false flag, or Trump won the election was a fraud. So these sort of right wing conspiracies, and then a lot of truthers have sort of gone down that trajectory where they're now like I said earlier, Sean Stone is hanging out with Rudy Giuliani, and I've seen people that I used to respect promoting Bernard Kerik. So I'm just did people forget? What happened? I mean, you don't have to be conspiratorial enough to think that Rudy Giuliani and Kerik had a direct hand in 9/11. But I think this is one thing truthers, Bat, you were saying, what are the things that they ignored, or these theories that took away focus from an actual evidence trail? Well, all the talk about the 9/11 crime scene, Adam, and the people who were so fixated on this idea of they thought the buildings were a controlled demolition. Where's the actual body of research people have done on who was there on the pile? What companies were they? Where's the paperwork? Where's the paper trail for these companies that clean this up? Where did those companies take their rubble? Which rubble did they take? It's I'm realizing, actually looking at I was, trying to put pieces together. nobody, like it simply has not been done, which is kind of unfortunate. So, that's something that I still think people can look at now. And actually, if you're interested in, looking at the World Trade Center site as a crime scene, and the evidence as, being destroyed as a potential cover up, it's like, who did that? How much were they paid? Who was in charge of that? And, exactly how did that play out? And I don't think we really have a clear picture of all that yet. So it's like people spent so much time trying to imagine how they thought, if thermite was used or whatever. It's like, but what about the stuff we can actually prove? It's like there's probably receipts, of all these companies. And after finding out recently that the Manafort brothers construction company was involved, and that a company that cleaned up one of the anthrax sites in Florida was also involved in disposing of some of the stuff in the World Trade Center site, I just think it needs to be looked at more closely. Because I think even if you don't, whatever you think about the buildings or how they fell, I believe they covered things up in both crime scenes. And I would like to know who those people were, and see if they're connected to anyone else suspicious.
Yeah, sure. And this is one subject that I'm sorely lacking in, is that when it comes to physics, and I was never, I'm less than a layman when it comes to physics, and I have to apologize for that, because this is one area I wish I knew a lot more than, because it's such a focal point in the truth movement, is about World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7. Whereas when I first started journeying down 9/11 was back in 2006, and one of the very first forums that I ever come across was the JREF, the James Randi Educational Forum, where I saw people like Tony Zambotti and Stephen Jones, and they were talking about how the buildings could have fell. And I'm looking at this, and it's almost like reading Sanskrit. So I'm so intimidated by them, like, oh my God, I don't know what they're talking about. And so I went down the geopolitical route, because I've already had an interest in true crime, La Cosa Nostra, Jonestown, stuff like that. And so that took me to where I'm at right now. The concept of like what took place at Ground Zero just hours after the buildings fell is interesting to me, because one of the first things that was done was to get the debris to do proper rescue and search and rescue operations. That debris was relocated to Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island.
Yeah.
One of the companies offered their services. I want to say I did a story about this, and it's in my WordPress, where I put all documents and files. And I forgot the name of the company, but they offered their Ford trucks to transport the debris to Fresh Kills, but they called Giuliani first.
I think you're talking about, I'm pretty sure you're talking about Marcor Remediation. I'm not sure. It might not be, but that's the same company that cleaned the site. And they actually, on their website, they brag about being the first company to be used at Fresh Kills. And it's just a weird thing that they got hired to clean up the Anthrax building, in right. Florida. So, I think the buildings, I think they're weird, but I think that I don't see anything there right now in terms of a research project that I'm going to be able to do anything on. I think that actually, looking at, now that I know all this stuff about Giuliani and the Anthrax, I think that it really would be valuable to, see what was actually this deal that was done with Bayo Steel, this Chinese company that apparently recycled all the steel. Mm-hmm. How did that take place? So was Rudy put in charge of that? And if so, why? Like, how is he the one given the authority to do that? I think all these questions have not been answered, because when you really go back and look, it's like somehow Rudy was able to like boss around FEMA. It's like, how? I thought FEMA was a federal agency. Why after an emergency like that, why was Rudy allowed to do that? And and given the fact that the West Nile virus outbreak happened under him, and he has this sort of heroic coming in to save the day with that, and he procured the contract for the company to remediate that. He has an odd history with, let's just say, bio events and terrorism. And then you also mentioned that you had an interest in La Cosa Nostra. I mean, I kind of went there inadvertently recently researching the Inquirer, because I didn't realize that it actually was a newspaper that was purchased on a mob loan from Frank Costello to Gene, what's his name? Ponerosa. I forgot how to pronounce his last name. You know what I'm talking about? Gene Pope, the guy who founded the Enquirer.
Oh no, I don't know his name.
His father was the guy who started, I guess, who ran the most popular Italian language newspaper in New York, and he was sort of in with the mob. And when his dad died, his son basically bought like a horse racing newspaper called the Enquirer, and he turned it into a gore tabloid with like police crime scene photos that were leaked by cops that were probably, already connected through the mob via his father. So it's, the whole thing is an interesting history where it's like you have this, military industrial complex mainstream media apparatus that already exists, but then you have sort of this coming off to the side in the late 60s and 70s, this mob, money purchased kind of tabloid that's sort of carving its own, path, and is actually breaking real stories and is doing things that like no, real journalists would ethically feel comfortable doing, and the CEO who later bought American Media Inc. and all those tabloids, David Pecker, is in really tight with Rudy Giuliani and Trump. And it's so fascinating because some of the new stuff that Gumby for Christ and I have been researching together for this new podcast is that it appears that David Pecker, his building gets attacked with anthrax. It basically becomes a money pit, or I don't know what word you would describe something that's like a property that's just like losing money. Like, this $5 million building, it's contaminated. He claims he couldn't sell it. Well, he sells it to some random land developer guy in Florida named David Rustine. Now, you might think, okay, maybe he was just didn't want to, maybe AMI, American Media Inc. didn't want to pay the money to clean the anthrax in the building, and they just wanted to get rid of it. Well, they sold the building for $40,000. Okay. That sounds kind of suspicious, right? To sell a $5 million building, even if it has contaminated anthrax, for $40,000. What's strange is David Rustine, this Florida Hollywood real estate, it's not Hollywood, just Florida Palm Beach area real estate guy. He has all these properties oddly located near 9/11 hijackers. And I started finding all these on the map. And his wife lives really close to some art students. And David Rustine has a building literally next door to a Richard Pearl publicly listed address. So just, these strange connections started popping up. So I'm looking at this $40,000 deal and thinking, this seems like something that they should have audited. It seems really suspicious. Why couldn't AMI hire a company to clean the anthrax like David Rustine ended up doing? David Rustine ended up hiring Rudy Giuliani's company, Bio One, to clean up the building. He ended up firing Rudy Giuliani's company and hiring Marcor Remediation, the first company that was on fresh kills, disposing of World Trade Center stuff. Now, apparently, David Rustine is family members with the people who started Marcor Remediation, which is just sort of an odd thing. Is the guy who buys the building contaminated with anthrax is family with Marcor Remediation. So you're kind of wondering, is this guy involved? What is this? Is it a dummy buyer, perhaps? I mean, it seems like David Rustine actually got two dummy buyers, which sounds ludicrous. But Gumby for Christ ended up finding recently that the guy who buys the building from David Rustine, after David Rustine cleans it up from anthrax, he buys it for something like $7 million. So he makes an extraordinary profit off of this building. That buyer lives like two houses down from David Pecker, the guy who originally sells the building, David Rustine. So it's just so weird. It's like, was this just like a dummy trade-off of this building? And what the hell happened here? And why is this so shady? And is David Pecker and AMI, were they involved in this somehow? I mean, it raises a lot of questions, I think. But I forgot to mention one thing, is that David Pecker, after he sells the building to Rustine, before he sells the building to Rustine, it's not just the building that he's selling to Rustine. For some reason, David Pecker and AMI sell the entire building's contents to Rustine, which includes basically millions of dollars of exclusive photo archives and archives of the National Enquirer and all of their tabloids going back like decades. And you just have to wonder, why would he have done that? Why? And it's strange too, because in the contract it says that when you're purchasing this building, you could come back into it and retrieve items if you'd like with EPA approval. You have to be hazmated up when you come in and get them, and you have to go through us to get them. But the whole contract in the purchase basically says that you're selling us all the contents, and we basically can destroy them whenever we want. Like, there's nothing saying like you have this much amount of time to come back and get the contents. You can get these contents. It's basically saying we could destroy the contents whenever we want. And essentially that's what it seems like the deal was intended to do. We're selling you this building at an extreme loss. It's very suspiciously slow. And then we're also just letting you destroy the entire building's contents. Why? Why would they do that? And this only came to light in the news because Rudy Giuliani's company ended up being sued by a photographer who wanted his photographs back. And in the lawsuit, it came up that they basically did destroy all the content. So David Rustine apparently wasn't even interested in saving all these contents. And it's a really strange story, Adam. I know I'm totally going off on a random tangent, but this is where the new Media Roots Anthrax research is going, and it's sort of trying to figure out, what was this whole AMI thing really about? Like, what was it? Was the letter that they say Robert Stevens breathed in, was that a hoax letter? Because why does the FBI not even use any story about that letter in their report? Why don't they believe any of the witnesses at the Enquirer? And there's also a totally different side of this that I think is interesting to go back and look at, is other journalists for like New York Times and Washington Post, they have what I can only describe as utter disdain for the people at the Enquirer. Like, they're talking about it like it's a tragic event, but they also, are basically think these people are trash. Like, the disdain that like regular DC Beltway reporters had for these, Enquirer tabloid people is very strong. And you have to wonder if that played into some of what happened. If like, that's why we got the coverage we did. And then also, I just read this random thing today that apparently the FBI hypnotized the AMI witnesses to have them tell the story about how they saw Robert Stevens handling the letter. And I don't know, you say you're into true crime, Adam. Is that something that the FBI does to witnesses? I've never heard that before. So I was reading that thinking, is there someone on the FBI who was trying to blow this from the very beginning? Like, because that just seems like a stupid thing to do. So I'm anyways, that's going to be the new podcast about
I was going to ask you before to let you go. Sure. What projects are you working on right now currently?
Well, that's probably the main one that I'm doing, is I'm trying to piece together the whole AMI, American Media Inc. Building cleanup. And also I'm just at the beginning of starting a larger research project on the entire World Trade Center building site cleanup. Because my theory here is that there are companies here that somehow Rudy Giuliani was connected to, or people he was friends with were connected to, who are already suspicious people. And I just want to see how much of that more there is, and to see where that goes, because I just think the Rudy angle of this, I think, has been largely ignored. I mean, I noticed there was Barbara Honecker, I think her name is, do you know how to pronounce her last name?
Barbara Honecker.
Barbara Honecker. I mean, I know a lot of people have problems with her Pentagon research. Like, I don't agree with her Pentagon research, but I saw she was going out there talking about Tripod 2, which was Rudy's, the drill that he had planned that was an anthrax bioterror drill on 9/12, which probably one of the craziest truther statements ever that turned out to be true to me was this idea that FEMA was there the night before and they had already put a lot of equipment there the night before. I thought that was just a total truther fart. Like, it wasn't real, but no, it's real. Like that. And that was from because of Tripod 2, which is sort of weird, to think that Rudy was running that drill with FEMA, on 9/12. And in actuality, the emergency command center that was supposed to be a World Trade Center 7 on the day of 9/11 ended up being moved to a pier somewhere else in Manhattan that was supposed to be the site of Tripod 2. Mm-hmm. They basically just moved their surrogate emergency command center set up to where the Tripod 2 was supposed to be. So, maybe they had a lot of more equipment already set up there that we don't know about. I don't know. It just, I mean, you can get into some really weird territories, and that's like, like we always talk about. You could speculate all day long, and there's so many. But yeah, I'm working on more Anthrax podcasts, but I am going to try to find more stuff and do more podcasts about the World Trade Center cleanup. I think maybe next year.
Sure. Let me ask you, Robbie, with all the work that you've done, past and currently, and the present, what are your hopes in achieving in doing all this?
I think to have a very small amount of incremental, if I could move the needle even just a tiny bit, I would be satisfied that I've made some contribution. I think, like I was even realizing a few days ago, like if I could just get like a Florida local reporter to be like, these St. Petersburg letters this is like a news story that I want to cover. Like this is like important local news. Like that would be a big deal to me. And I think that would, create an opening, and even if it's a really tiny one, because I look at almost like an investment, even if no one cares, there'd be a lot of like people at home watching a local news story or reading the newspaper who've never even heard of this before. And so I think if you can reorient people, because the FBI obviously erased this. And I guess I'm hopeful that if you could lay out things with facts and make things easy to understand for people, that there's a way to, move this somehow. And whether that means, maybe the most hopeful outcome that I sometimes fantasize about is someone else coming out from the FBI, blowing the whistle, 20 years later and being like, yeah, everybody knew this was bullshit. Like we were tasked with covering this up, because that everybody in the FBI knows this bullshit. I mean, even if some of them, like I was saying earlier, think Ivans has some link to the crime, anybody who knows about those St. Petersburg letters in the FBI knows there couldn't have been one person. So it's just, I'm hopeful that there's people on the inside who are not total pieces of shit who want to tell the truth about this, and maybe they just haven't found the courage to do so yet. So maybe that's that's something that's the most hopeful that I get, I guess.
Robbie Martin, 9/11 filmmaker, producer, activist. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Adam.